What are these streaks in my images and how do I get rid of them? I'm going to talk all about banding on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a question, you know what to do. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form on the site. I just might pick your question to answer on a future show. As you probably know, I'm on the road again this year with Luke Combs as his official tour photographer, and you can actually join me at a show by attending my Shoot from the Pit live concert photography workshop. I'm thrilled to announce I've just opened up dates in New Zealand, Australia, and Europe. There are now 30 cities to choose from around the world, and I hope you'll join me at least one of them. Go to shootfromthepit.com for more info and to sign up right away. Don't wait. They are going to sell out. Also, thanks to every one of you who has voted for me for favorite tour photographer at the upcoming iHeartRadio Music Awards. You can vote again every day until March 21st, 2023, and I'll put the links down below so you can do that. It only takes a few seconds and really means a lot to me. Thanks so much for all your support over the years. Okay, speaking of tour photography, I've got a question for today's show that was sent in by Jeff S., and he wants to know, what causes banding in concert photos? I usually experience it when there's a lot of smoke and black light in the scene. Thanks, Jeff. This is actually an issue that hits very close to home since I shoot a lot of concerts and have seen this many, many times. Now, what's he talking about here? Take a look at this photo of Luke Combs. When I snapped this picture, that's not what the light looked like in real life. My eyes just saw a solid beam of light, and it didn't have any of those streaks of light and dark that are clearly visible in the image. But what's really going on here? You're mostly going to see bands like this when photographing environments lit by LED lights. These are relatively new in the concert world, and everybody seems to be using them. On Luke's tour, our awesome lighting director, Kevin Northrup, designed and runs our show. I talked to him about this particular topic, and he told me that tours have switched to LEDs for a number of different reasons. Most importantly is the long, stable life of the light source. Older fixtures required somewhat expensive lamps that could explode. He said that explosions don't have that much power behind them, so it's not that dangerous to the audience or performers, but it can cause catastrophic failures within the fixture itself. That's actually the terminology he used, catastrophic failures. That doesn't sound very good to me. Now, LEDs also, they generate a little less heat than the old fixtures, but the kinds that we use on tour have such a high wattage that it is still possible to overheat them. Overall, though, LEDs have better reliability, they've got more long-term consistency, they require less maintenance, and they typically use less wattage per lumen. You also can get a lot more output in saturated colors. I've got to say, both as a photographer and as a fan, the light shows that bands are creating these days look super awesome, so I totally think it's worth it. Unfortunately, this is one of the few situations where new technology has actually worked against us photographers. It might look like a solid light, but the LEDs actually work by sending out pulses of light. Now, our eyes and our brain do an amazing job of compensating, and it looks solid, but camera sensors can't quite do that yet. Because the digital sensor scans lines relatively slowly, one row at a time, you wind up seeing those in-between phases where the light isn't on or isn't quite as bright. You also might see a different color sometimes in those spaces. Now, one day we might have cameras with global shutters in them, and that is going to fix this issue. That's a sensor that can capture the entire shot all at once instead of having to read it one line at a time. For now, though, the cameras are getting faster and faster with each generation, so that does help to minimize the effect. Now, it's also important to note that you won't see this all the time. You're not going to have it in every frame. In my experience at our shows, I see it mostly when there's light pointed directly into the camera lens. Jeff, who asked the question, said that he sees it when there's smoke or black light. Now, I'm no engineer, so I can't tell you exactly why it happens in some situations and not in others. I am, however, a photographer and can give you some tips to eliminate or minimize those streaks. First, don't think you're going to fix this in post-processing. It's not going to happen. If it's very minimal, maybe you could lower your contrast a little bit to make the streaks look a little less dramatic. But one tip I can give you is to look at the image after you've worked on it small, like thumbnail size. I've worked on images full screen and thought that it looks really great and you can barely see the banding. But then when I pull up the context sheet in Photo Mechanic, bam, there all of those streaks are again, much stronger than I thought. Remember, most people are going to be looking at your images small on their phone, and phone screens are usually really punchy and the contrast is turned way up, so everything looks really good. So zoom out and see how that looks before you're done with it. But it's really better to shoot so you don't have any banding in the first place. And there are two main things you can do to help yourself out here. First of all, if your camera has the option of shooting with a mechanical or an electronic shutter, use mechanical. I did a video about first current electronic shutter recently, and I talked about the pros and cons of each type. I'm going to put a link in the description down below if you want to watch that. But just know that using an electronic shutter means that the sensor is going to scan much slower when it pulls the data off of there than that quick light cutoff when you use a mechanical shutter. So your risk of seeing banding is much higher when you use the electronic shutter. Now, if you're using a DSLR camera, then you're definitely using mechanical shutter, no problem there. If you're shooting in silent mode, that's definitely an electronic shutter. Now, some mirrorless cameras like my Canon R3 and R5s, those are going to give you the option to choose which shutter mode you want. And then there are a few new mirrorless cameras out today that only offer electronics, so you obviously would be stuck with it at that point. Now, while your chances of seeing banding are lessened with the mechanical shutter, you can still get it. It still does happen with the mechanical shutter. All of the images I've shown you today were shot with the mechanical shutter on one of my R3 bodies. The only surefire way to really eliminate banding is to slow down your shutter speed. Basically, by having your sensor exposed for a longer period of time, those pulses begin to overlap each other, so it appears as one solid block of light. Now, how slow do you need to go? Well, that really depends on the light, since they're all going to be a bit different. But at our shows, I found that 125th of a second was where it first started to go away. Any slower than that is fine too, of course. But the challenge is that if you're trying to shoot a fast-moving subject, you may not want to slow down your shutter speed that much. But I always say the technical part of photography is a give and take. If you don't want any banding, you need to give up some of your shutter speed. You just have to make that trade-off. Now, in the real world, I shoot concerts like I shot sports back in the day, and I'm always at fast shutter speeds to freeze the action. However, the faster the shutter speed, the more intense those bands are. This frame is at 32 hundredths of a second, while this one is at 8 hundredths of a second. The slower shutter speed looks better. The darker areas aren't quite as dark because some of that light is filling it in during that slower shutter speed. Sidebar, just so you don't ask me this in the comments, you might be wondering why I was shooting at 32 hundredths of a second. Well, it has to do with the way I expose for concert photos. I want a fast shutter speed to freeze all the action. So I start with a pretty high ISO. That's really no problem. Something like 6400 with these cameras today, it still looks really good. And then I quickly adjust my shutter speed as the light changes throughout the night. I actually did a video about my technique for dealing with fast changing light that I jokingly call my Bergman brightness button. I'm going to put a link down to that below as well. But at that particular moment in the show, the stage lighting at this angle was very bright, so I was at 3200. All right, with that out of the way, now look at these next two pictures. For this one, I was at a shutter speed of 2500 at f4 at 6400 ISO. Because those lights were hitting right into the lens, I had a feeling that I might see some banding. As soon as I shot a burst of images, I could see the dark bands moving across my photos in the viewfinder. Because we were at a point in the show where Luke was singing a ballad and the mic was on the mic stand, I figured he wouldn't be moving around too much. So I left my aperture at f4 and lowered my ISO to 400. I then could drop my shutter speed to 1/25th of a second. Boom, clean, no streaks at all, right? I shot most of the song like this and then went back to my old settings when he was done. So that's really it. Mechanical shutter if you can, and slow down your shutter speed. Next time you've got banding, test it yourself to see how slow you have to go with the lights you're shooting in that particular environment. Your mileage can and will vary. Thanks, Jeff, so much for sending in that question. I hope that helps you and everybody else who's watching. Have you guys had this problem with banding? How have you dealt with it? Let me know down in the comments below. I'm curious if you have any other solutions to fix this. There's only really so much you can do. Also, do me a favor and like, subscribe, click the bell icon so you get notifications. Check out my Shoot from the Pit workshops, and I appreciate you voting for me as your favorite tour photographer every day through March 21st. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next time with another question right here on Ask David Bergman.